Hey Wapters, Mr. Lassiter with you, and in this lecture I'm going to continue with Chapter 26, the new power balance, and we're going to be talking about social changes, which we actually started with in class today, but just to be kind of complete, I'm going to kind of review or recap some of the stuff that we did and talked about, as well as delve into some of the areas we didn't get to, especially middle class and working class women. So let's get started with population migration. Of course, population of Europe was growing really ever since new crops were introduced following the Columbian Exchange. And as European population grew, millions of Europeans started migrating to other continents to find work especially in industrializing nations. We see migrations between 1850 and 1914 to places like the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Argentina. Argentina being the most industrialized nation in South America. As a result of the growth of the European population at home and the emigration of Europeans to other places, we see the proportion of people of European ancestry in the world rise from about 1/5 to 1/3 of all people in the world. Some reasons for this increase include the drop in death rate, improved crop yields across countries across North America, especially grain that was grown in the western lands of North America could be transported to Europe cheaply. Also, we see new agricultural land being opened up around the world, and of course with railroads and steamships we're able to get those resources to other areas of the world. There's also a more abundant year-round diet. We see canning and refrigeration coming into play in the later half of the 19th century. And don't forget that we also see a lot of Asian migration during this time period, especially as indentured laborers. And we talked about that earlier this week when we, if you follow my mouse, talked about migration from places like India and Burma to other regions of the British Empire, including Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc. Of course, going back, Asian migration to the western coast of the United States is extremely important in the growth of the western United States, and especially in the railroad market, or in the railroad industry. That continues until the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in the United States, which severely limits immigration from Asian nations. But as this population grew and interconnectedness and trade grew, so did cities. And so cities began to grow to enormous sizes in the latter half of the 19th century in Europe, North America, and even Japan. So in some places, too, we see smaller towns actually begin to grow, and then towns fuse with one another to create kind of larger and larger cities. But this change in kind of the character of cities and urban areas poses very difficult problems. How do you house all these people? How do you house them safely? How do you keep good sanitation to keep people healthy? How do you protect this urban environment? And so new technologies come into play and are aimed at improving and transforming urban life. Those include things like mass transit, sewage and water systems, in order to kind of make cities more or improve cleanliness in cities. Mass transit, eventually replacing old horse and buggies, things like that, removes another type of waste from the streets. Gas and electric lighting, police and fire departments improve safety drastically in cities. Sanitation and garbage removal, again, for health reasons. Building and health inspections to protect the health of these urban citizens. Schools were built, parks were built, and other amenities for education and leisure. Also zoos, for example, to the right. I actually kind of randomly chose this picture, but it fits. This is a zoo in England in 1852, and it's a cute little hippopotamus. But nevertheless, another leisure activity. Go into the zoo. New neighborhoods, of course, pop up in these cities and had to be built to accommodate the growing population. And older areas were often rebuilt. And they were usually, when cities expanded and they were built, they were laid out along rectangular grid patterns with very wide boulevards, modern apartment buildings. And these regions were divided into different zones: industrial zones, commercial zones, and residential zones. And those residential zones were even subdivided by different social classes. But even with these accomplishments, keep in mind that not everything was hunky-dory in cities. Powering these cities were oftentimes coal plants. The factories ran on electricity powered by coal. And so coal used as fuel polluted the air. And even as we see kind of other forms of waste be cleaned up by the replacement of, let's say, horses with streetcars and automobiles, we have this other type of pollution. Here you see a coal pollution in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the United States in the 1800s. So let's move on to our third big topic under these social changes, which is middle-class women and the idea of this separate sphere, which is something that I think is very important for you to burn into your brain. So middle-class women inherited this idea of a separate sphere from men. They devoted their lives to their homes and families, and that was really the ideal for middle-class women. But there are a few cases of women fighting for equal rights. This occurs during a Victorian age, and that idea of a Victorian age refers to the reign of Queen Victoria, Queen of England, from 1837 to 1901, so almost the entirety of this 19th century. But it also, this term Victorian refers to kind of the rules of behavior and ideology, and this idea that women belong in the home while men belong out working. And so they were thought to belong to these separate spheres. And women were considered physically weaker, yet morally superior. And this was seen to be perfectly suited for the domestic sphere. And these two images kind of show this: men out, engaging in politics and trade and business, and women staying in the home with children, cleaning. But staying in the home was not easy work. It demanded a great deal of work among middle-class women. And even though new technology was coming into play that would seemingly make being a homemaker easy, or easier, rising standards of cleanliness during the Victorian era meant that there was more to do at the house. So we still see a high workload for middle-class homemakers. But the most important duty of these middle-class women was to raise children, and raise their children along kind of Victorian morals. Victorian mothers spent a lot of time with their children, but ultimately girls receive an education very different from that of their male siblings. So let's talk a little bit more about middle-class women, because oftentimes we seem to talk about the aristocracy and women who are involved in politics or not involved in politics, or just lower-class women. So this is, the middle class, which benefits most from the Industrial Revolution. There is enforced legal discrimination against women in the 19th century. And oftentimes society frowned on middle-class women having any careers other than teaching. Teaching was a permissible career, but that was usually done by single women, and when they got married and had children, that was not proper for them. And jobs that required a higher education, generally women were excluded. Now this isn't, you can't say all women were excluded, but in general. Some middle-class women, though, are not satisfied with their home life, and they become involved in volunteer work, the abolitionist movement, or the women's suffrage movement. And I believe, I can't remember exactly if we talked about the Seneca Falls Convention, but this is one instance where middle-class women got together because they were not included in the male-dominated abolitionist movement, and they get together and they write a Declaration of Sentiments modeled on the Declaration of Independence, where they state that men have violated women's natural rights, that women and men are created equally and they should have all the same rights, but men has infringed upon those, and even goes so far as to say something along the lines of where women have property rights as single women and they can work and make their own money and make their own life. When they are married, they are put into chains of bondage because they are not allowed to have their own property. Because upon marriage, it becomes the property of the husband. Kind of things like this, which is a good point, mind you, that they were making. But this is a minority of middle-class women who become involved in this. Eventually, they will, of course, succeed in granting women's suffrage. So the last section here on working class women. Working class women have a very different life, of course, than middle class women. They had to keep their home. They were still responsible for the home, but they were also out earning a living and usually led fairly difficult lives. Many women became domestic servants, and this is pretty steady throughout the time period. As we've talked about before, they faced long hours, hard physical labor, and women who worked as domestic service also, some of them, experienced sexual abuse from their employers. Many young women tended to work in factory, especially single women, and they were, of course, poorly paid. We know about poor working conditions that were addressed by things like the Factory Acts and the Mine Acts in Britain. And they usually worked in textile and clothing trades, which is something of a continuity we see with women. Even when they were working in the home before industrialization, they would tend to work in these areas, textile and clothing. Married women, it would not be seen necessarily proper for them to work in a factory. Instead, they would become homemakers, but they would still be contributing to the family income. And usually that might look like taking in boarders or sewing or washing other people's clothes or some other type of work. But when demanded or when absolutely necessary, married women still might work in factories to bring in a second income for lower class families. So that's it. Tomorrow we're going to move on and talk about socialism and labor movements. So that's all I really have for you in this video. You may be watching this after we talk about socialism and labor movements, so just go back, make sure you get it, and that you can identify some of the continuities and changes in society in the latter half of the 19th century. All right, that's it, guys.